Nothing makes an American feel less confident than world geography and world history. And I'm not talking about World War II, the favorite war of white folks alike to discuss. But speaking of World War II, which in my opinion started at different times and different places for different people, China had already been fighting long before that and up through World War II with itself in a civil war between communist beliefs and nationalistic beliefs. China was also fighting Japan for years, first in the First Sino Japanese War, then in the Second Sino Japanese War, which I can honestly say I remember nothing about learning in school. Today, I'm going to provide you with a little side quest here and there to help you understand the political climate that we're dealing with in this story. You're welcome. The US has always been largely criticized over its complete lack of basically any, Asian American history. After researching this set of incidents, it has become increasingly and incredibly obvious that this is true. Let's be honest, war has always been the top producer of atrocities, a grotesque opera where power and survival completely collide. But beneath the smoke of the gunfire, hidden in shadowy camps and garrisons, exists another war, one fought on the bodies of the vulnerable, and one that weaponized sex. Today, I will reveal three stories of three women: Maria Rosa Henson from the Philippines, Kim Hok Soon from China, and Kimiko Kaneda from Korea, whose lives were stolen away and nearly erased thanks to an idea that enabled and even institutionalized an atrocity comparable to the Holocaust, easily comparable to the Holocaust. In fact, the tragedy that I am going to tell today is often called the Forgotten Holocaust or Asia's Holocaust, I believe. But this certainly isn't a contest. These women were not soldiers. They held no weapons. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were workers. They were of different ethnicities, and they were caught in the extraordinary violence of war and misogyny. Forced into sexual slavery, they became what history now refers to as yanfu, or comfort women in English, a heavily resented and sanitized term for unspeakable suffering. I mean, comfort to whom? Not these women, as you'll come to find out. Their identity became a wartime object that the very worst things that can ever happen to a woman will happen. From perpetuating this term, instead opting to humanize the hundreds of thousands of victims and survivors by using their names where I can. I will also use the term comfort stations or comfort station system. This isn't a story about silence. It's a story about survival, about voices that refuse to die even when the world begged them to be quiet. Rosa, Kimiko, and Haksun's lives did not physically intersect, but their pain and their resilience bound them in ways that transcend space and time. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack When Misogyny Leads to Mayhem. We'll explore the experiences of the very women who survived sexual slavery in these inhumane comfort stations, told from their perspectives. Also, from the arguably thought reformed perspectives of the soldiers who believed themselves entitled to basically anything they wanted, and even from the cold perspective of the suffocating stranglehold of war itself. Except I don't wish to place blame on any certain entity. This is history. I do like to place blame, though, on these patriarchal systems of coercion and control and misogyny. Colonialism has happened all throughout history, all the way up to this very second. It's happening right now. This price of these conquests, though, is very expensive because the cost is human life. This is a very dark part of somewhat untold human history that I think is very important for us to learn. But seriously, you guys, brace yourself. This episode contains content that discusses war crimes, sexual assault, crimes against children, torture, and addiction. Use discretion how and where you listen. I will be using SA in place of sexual assault where I can. This is a story of pain, power. This is a story of pain, power, but mostly male privilege, and the cruelty that lurks beneath the facades of fighting a war. It hides within the shadows of humanity, clawing its way back to the light to face judgment from us. So let's get in the sack. Maria Rosa Henson was born in 1927 in the Philippines, a country under American colonial rule, and that was later plunged into the chaos of the Second World War. She was the product of an extramarital affair, the daughter of a peasant mother and a wealthy landowning father. Let's take a closer look. Maria was born on December 5th, 1927, in Pasay City of Pampanga, Philippines. At 14 years old, Maria had dreams of becoming a doctor. She found herself dealing with a changing political climate due to the Pacific War, moreover, Japanese occupation in her country. Around a year later, she was SA'd by three Japanese soldiers as she separated from her uncles while gathering firewood. The alarming part was that one of the soldiers appeared to be an officer of the higher ranks. As she went to gather firewood again 2 weeks later, probably feeling her gut instinct screaming at her to run as a trauma response, that soldier, who looked a lot like an officer, returned to assault her again. She was devastated, but devastated isn't really the right word. She was full of rage, like any of us would be. And she took all of that anger and that rage and she got active. She joined the anti Japanese guerrilla military group called Hukbalahop. She helped the guerrilla group by gathering medicine, food, and by couriering for them. In April 1943, she was arrested by the Japanese sentry. She was taken to like a makeshift Japanese headquarters, and while she was there, she was forced into sexual servitude. In August 1943, her and a few other women and girls were moved to a hospital turned garrison in Angles. And so her torturous living arrangements began. Lola Rosa, that's what they called her. That was like her nickname. If I'm not mistaken, it means Grandma Rosa. She was a woman forced to work at these comfort stations for approximately 9 months, though I'm willing to bet that remnants of her soul could be scraped off of the walls of that hellish concentration camp looking facility. In January 1944, guerrillas, it seems to be the same guerrilla group that she was working for, Hukbalahop, rescued her. After decades of shame and silence and this lingering cryptic message that you will bring unspeakable humiliation onto your family if you speak up and speak out. Rosa eventually did get married and she had children, but she was still so angry about the abuse, but also about the unsaid threat to be silent. But Rosa did survive. When the war ended in 1945, she returned to her family, but she was carrying the scars that no one dared name. For decades, she kept silent, as so many others did, fearing judgment, shame, and disbelief. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 50 years later, that Rosa stepped forward, becoming the first Filipino woman to publicly identify as a former comfort woman. Her testimony shattered the silence, and it sparked a movement that demanded recognition and it demanded justice. While Rosa struggled to reclaim her life in the Philippines, another story was unfolding miles away across the sea in Korea. Kim Hok-soon was only 17 when she too was taken. Born in 1924, Hok-soon grew up in a Korea under Japanese occupation, where every aspect of her life was dictated and decided by imperial rule. When her family fell into financial ruin, she was sold to a man who later forced her into a comfort station. Now, it's a little bit hard to say if it was her stepdad who sold her to someone who put her into the comfort stations, or if she was abducted by Japanese officials later. We'll talk about it. Let's delve in. Kim Hok-soon was born in Jilin, China, in 1924. Things were looking pretty optimistic for Kim. Her father was an avid independence activist supporting the Korean Independence Army. Kim's folks originally lived in Pyongyang, which is now in North Korea, but back then it was just Korea. But they had to flee due to Japanese oppression that occurred as a result of the First Sino-Japanese War. Sound familiar? We talked about that earlier, remember? Then Kim's father passed away when she was just 3 months old, and her mother and her had to move back to Pyongyang. At the worst possible time, 14 years old to be exact, Kim's mom remarried, and this dude, he was not a good guy. Not a good guy like her dad, anyway. In fact, the pressure that old stepdad created was so much that Kim's mom sent her to live with a foster family who taught the art of kissing. Now, kissing is similar to that of a geisha. The Japanese occupation seemed to directly cause the Kisang's culture to merge much more with prostitution than the other parts of it, which are arts and dance. Kim did really well learning the different arts such as pansori and other forms of entertainment, but she was too young to obtain a license to become a Kisang because she was only 17, and the age for a license to become a Kisang, you had to be 19. So, too young. Way to go, stepdad. Way to do that research. So, what now? Well, since she couldn't work, her stepdad took her and her foster sister to sell them in Beijing, where a run in with Japanese officials, or he sold her straight up, that resulted in her abduction into the comfort station system, where she was forced into sexual slavery, forced to become someone else. Aiko would be her new name. And, there are many stories about how the soldiers would sometimes, quote, fall in love with women forced into this sexual servitude. That would be like the very worst. Then you have to try to humor to like get out, to get help, to get anyone to even look at you and see you as a human. Anyway, Many would promise to help, but then, as soon as it was over, of course, war ambitions came back and loyalty would return to the soldiers all of a sudden. There was, however, a Korean who seemed to be allowed to just come and go as he pleased one day at the garrison in Beijing. Now, I've researched the hell out of this event and events surrounding the beginning of the production and execution of these stations, and it's safe to say that a Korean in a Japanese occupied Chinese comfort station was in extreme danger. But through my research, it seems as though, or at least he was thought to maybe have been supplying heroin to the comfort station, since it was a common commodity for the soldiers to further coerce and control the women who were forced to be there. It seems as though Kim saw her opportunity through this, though, and jumped at it, begging the Korean man, please, please, please help me escape, to which he did oblige. Keep in mind, though, that he met her at a comfort station. Their first encounter was sexual assault. While he was instrumental to her escape, and she did marry him, he was an alcoholic who was very aggressive, and he was emotionally abusive. After the war ended, Kim lost her daughter to cholera, and as if that wasn't devastating, she lost her son some years later due to what seems like a heart attack, but it happened while he was swimming in the ocean, so maybe the heart attack came from drowning. Anyway, between the two deaths of her only children, her husband also died in a freak accident on a roof, or I guess he fell from a roof, which allowed her to finally be free from the emotional abuse. He was so cruel that he allegedly would use her previous forced sexual slavery against her just because he could. We know, especially in the 40s, how people saw sexual assault many times as the woman's fault, something the woman did. That hasn't changed too much, but I think it was a little more extreme in this case. This misogynistic view was so deeply ingrained during this time period all over the world. Kim Hok-soon's experiences mirrored Rosa's. Days and nights of relentless abuse. Her youth consumed by a war she wanted nothing to do with. Like Rosa, Hoksoon emerged from the war alive, but so profoundly changed. And like Rosa, she carried her story in silence for decades. But in 1991, Kim Hok-soon's voice broke through that silence. Standing before the world, she became the first, quote, comfort woman to testify publicly about her experiences. Her bravery ignited a sort of global reckoning, forcing governments and institutions to confront a history that so many have tried to bury alive. The third woman I'd like to talk about is named Kimiko Kaneda. She was born in Tokyo on October 22nd, 1921, but she seemed to be moved into Korea shortly after she was born. Kimiko's life was one of displacement and disconnection. Like Rosa and Haksun, she endured the horrors of comfort stations. But Kimiko's story, like so many other women who barely survived this abuse and torment, didn't end with the war's conclusion. For unknown reasons, she was separated from her mother right after birth and taken to her father's side of the family and eventually reunited with her father. Now, this sudden departure could have to do with rising tensions between the First and the Second Sino-Japanese War. After her lonely childhood, she was eventually reunited with her dad, but at just 14, he was arrested by the occupying Japanese police for failing to visit Japanese shrines. He was a priest. So, in Japanese, he lied to the police and said, "Yeah, yeah, of course, I'll bring my congregants there. No problem." Spoiler alert, he did not take his congregants to the Japanese shrines to pray or whatever. So eventually the police returned, but thanks to warnings that Kimiko was able to shout to him while he was praying in the church, an escape to Sangju was possible. At 16, Kimiko was told about a higher paying job by a Japanese family either her friend or both her and her friend were working for. Someone Japanese was said to have led her to this job opportunity, where she was forced onto a train from Seoul to Tianjin and then onto Zhaoquan. This is where the abuse began. After spending the night on the dining room floor of this place that she had been brought to, Himiko awoke and was assigned a room. Not even minutes later, a soldier walked in. The enemy. Well, her new enemy. She was able to fend him off, but the next soldier was wasted and in no mood for the niceties of humanity. As she tried to keep him away, he growled at her, "If you don't do what I say, I'll kill you." To Kimiko, death was welcome. It was a welcome thought, and as she was thinking about this, she felt a coldness in her chest and looked down to see a knife protruding from it, his hand still attached. As he removed it, blood began to soak her clothing. Outside the door, he was gently reprimanded for stabbing one of the women at the station. But Kimiko, 20 days in the infirmary, and then a ticket straight back to hell, aka her room at the comfort station. As soon as she returned from the infirmary, she was right back to work. The next soldier requesting her services just seemed triggered. And I don't mean in the sense of his weapon or his job, but by her bandages and by the plaster that encased her chest to protect the stab wound. After she again refused to cooperate, I mean, who could in such circumstances? He grabbed her up by the wrists and threw her. And then he just started kicking her hands and her wrists mainly, viciously seeming to cause the most pain and the most damage. The next comfort station she was transported to in Shachachuang was ridiculously busy. Approximately 20 or more men would line up outside throughout the day. I mean, can you imagine a single file line to keep the order while each man sexually assaults Kimiko because, God forbid, anyone break the rules or cut the line or, no cutsies, no cuts, no butts, no coconuts. Isn't that what kids say? Oh my god. Kimiko later had to have a hysterectomy due to internal damage from being at the comfort station for so long. Kimiko watched in horror and disgust as these barbaric soldiers would bring little girls into the comfort station that they had rounded up from schoolyards for their sick, cruel recreations. Side rant, the name of the agency to which funded the comfort stations after the end of World War II was actually titled Recreation and Amusement Association. Isn't that wild? Anyway, these recreations caused severe infections to these underdeveloped little bodies. There was no medicine to treat them. The only medicine there on the stations was medicines to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. So, good luck with that, right? Oh my God, look at that laceration. Here, let's slather some prophylactics on it. That'll do the trick. Oh, for real though. They first used some type of mercury ointment, which was called mercurochrome. That sounds terrible. Mercurochrome, which caused more problems than it did heal due to its high mercury levels. There wasn't even treatment for sepsis. Kimiko often heard haunting cries during the night, cries for comfort, cries for their mom, also cries for death. The only care for the ill was to place them in trenches. And as you can imagine, that was not only inhumane, but also hugely ineffective. There was no medicine, no electricity, and nearly no food. When Kimiko wasn't being physically or sexually assaulted, she was a nurse. She took notice that no matter how badly the soldiers were injured, they didn't give that bonsai battle cry of Japan. They cried for their mom. They cried for their families. They looked at pictures of their family. When she was caring for the soldiers, she showed them more genuine humanity than she'd probably ever been shown in her entire life. For Kimiko, survival came with a cost. Addiction, a shiny side effect of the opium forced upon her during her captivity, followed her into the post war years. Struggling to navigate a world that offered no support, in fact, it was almost like minus support because it was shame and humiliation involved. Kimiko's pain lingered long after the gunfire ceased. The paths of Rosa, Haksune, and Kimiko converged with an existential crisis of sorts that dehumanized them, but it also brought them together in a shared resilience. The atrocities endured by Maria, Kim, and Kimiko were the byproduct of a system that uses shame, coercion, and humiliation to achieve its imperial ambitions. To understand how this system came to be, we must examine the Japanese Empire of the 20th century. Here comes another little history lesson. It's important to know the context, though, I feel. At its peak, Japan's imperialist system stretched across East Asia, fueled by a belief in cultural and racial superiority. Meanwhile, territories like Korea, China, and the Philippines became stepping stones, or more like stomping stones, in Japan's bid for dominance. And it's really because of their resources, labor, and easily exploited people. Let's be real. Believe it or not, they even avoided signing the Geneva Convention agreement. Both of them. Yeah, I feel like this is something that has to be expanded on. The Geneva Conventions, which sought to protect the rights of prisoners of war, civilians, and the wounded during conflicts, would have placed restrictions on Japan's military actions, especially in territories it wanted to control. Japan was intent on establishing what they referred to, and get ready for this, as the Greater East Asia Co Prosperity Sphere. Doesn't that sound culty? Which essentially would serve as an economic and military bloc under Japanese domination. Participating in the Geneva Conventions would mean that Japan would have to adhere to international standards of the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and warfare. And that would just complicate its expansionist and militaristic goals. That's just not acceptable for Japan, apparently. Japan's military leaders saw the Geneva Conventions as a product of Western nations that sought to limit Japan's military autonomy. Japanese militarism at the time was rooted in a sense of exceptionalism and superiority, both culturally and militarily. The notion of, quote, honor in war, which was central to their samurai heritage, was vastly different from the humanitarian concerns that the Geneva Conventions sought to enforce. In their eyes, Japan was not bound by the same moral and ethical considerations as the Western powers. Japan feels like that narcissistic person in your life who treats you and behaves one way in public and then is totally different in private. Now, Japan had developed a different military code, the Bushido Code, which relentlessly emphasized loyalty, honor, and unsurprisingly, self sacrifice. The Geneva Convention would make it difficult for the boys will be boys trope to occur. It's almost safe to say that it's exactly how it looks, right? I mean, they avoided signing the Geneva Convention 2 times because they knew they would have to be held accountable for their actions, and they didn't feel that they should have to be held to those standards. Japan's non participation in the signing of the Geneva Conventions during the early 20th century was a clear reflection of its deep imperial ambitions and its rejection of Western norms, its desire to wage war completely lacking humanity, the rejection of international law. It just paved the way for Japan's aggressive, violently misogynistic hopes and dreams. Now, to give you guys a brief idea of the freezing cold political climate that led up to the nearly systematic use of comfort stations, we have to discuss the rape of Nanjing or the Nanjing massacre. I'm going to say Nanjing because I feel it's more respectful and it's probably how it's supposed to be said anyway. Nanking is probably just, y'all already know, people not wanting to pronounce dialects from other countries. But I could be wrong, but I chose not to delve into that part of the research because I'm just going to say Nanjing. The assault on Nanjing, also known as the Nanjing Massacre, was a pivotal event that exposed the extreme brutality of the Japanese Imperial Army during its expansionist campaigns in China. The atrocities committed during this time, mass murder, widespread sexual violence, and the systematic destruction of the city's population played a direct role in the establishment and the expansion of the comfort stations. I'd like to share one of my sources with you, a quote actually from her book, which is called From the Rape of Nanjing, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. It was written in 1997 by Iris Chang, and she says, quote, when the city fell on December 13th, 1937, Japanese soldiers began an orgy of cruel, seldom if ever matched in history. Tens of thousands of young men were rounded up and herded to the outer areas of the city, where they were mowed down by machine guns, used for bayonet practice, or soaked with gasoline and burned alive. By the end of the massacre, an estimated 260,000 to 350,000 Chinese had been killed. Iris goes on to say, quote, between 20,000 and 80,000 Chinese women were raped, and many soldiers went beyond rape to disembowel women, slice off their breasts, nail them alive to walls. So brutal were the Japanese in Nanjing that even the Nazis in the city were shocked. End quote. Body disposal became a huge problem. The soldiers started throwing bodies into the Yangtze River. So many bodies, in fact, that the river was said to have run red with blood. The scale of sexual violence in Nanjing was astronomical. During this incident, as I said earlier in the quote, an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 women were essayed by the Japanese soldiers over a span of just 6 weeks. The violence was indiscriminate. Victims included girls, elderly women, and even pregnant women. Survivors often described these assaults being carried out in public, with entire families being forced to watch. The mass violence shocked some Japanese officials, even, and led to concerns that such public acts of brutality would tarnish Japan's reputation and undermine troop discipline. You guys thought I was going to say something else, huh? No, they were worried about their reputation. That's going to be a common trope throughout this. Nanjing became a turning point in how the Japanese military approached the issue of sexual violence within its ranks, though comfort stations continued to operate until the end of World War II. You see, the Nanjing massacre exposed how out of control the soldiers were. The Japanese military realized that it needed to, quote, control its soldiers' sexual urges to prevent such atrocities from becoming a liability. This is what led to the formal establishment of the comfort station system, which aimed to provide regulated sexual access for soldiers. These stations were even falsely promoted as a way to protect local populations from mass rape while maintaining troop morale. A win for everyone, huh? Comfort stations were designed to create a veneer of order to drape over the chaos of sexual violence, but in reality, they institutionalized and industrialized that violence, turning it into a system of exploitation. This was quite literally state sponsored sexual slavery. As Japan's military campaigns expanded across Asia, the demand for comfort stations increased. Following the invasion of China and the horrors of Nanjing, Japan escalated its war efforts into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Each new front brought more troops. With more troops, more services were needed that the military justified as essential for morale and discipline. The Nanjing Massacre set the precedent for the military to proactively exploit women through the comfort station system. It marked the shift from spontaneous, large scale sexual violence to an organized crime like system of forced sexual slavery. The atrocities in Nanjing desensitized the Japanese military to these extreme acts of violence against civilians, especially women and children. The normalization of such behavior reinforced the systemic dehumanization of the populations Japan sought to subjugate. This mindset of entitlement to the bodies of colonized women became a core feature of the comfort station system. And the Japanese propaganda further dehumanized the women of the occupied territories, portraying them as inferior or less than, or even as spoils of war. Ugh. In the aftermath of Nanjing, this propaganda machine of Japan's completely justified the use of comfort stations as a quote necessary evil to maintain order and support the empire's military ambitions. We haven't even touched on how deeply superstitious and how deep mythology was ingrained into the soldier's mentality. The Empire of Japan had some twisted beliefs on the battlefield. It turned bodies into trophies and rituals. The superstitions of the Imperial Japanese Army could even be heard in the streets of Nanjing. Whispers about stealing the lives of women so that they can become more powerful, only if they're a virgin, of course. Otherwise, that's ineffective. But I wonder How could they have known? Did they wear a sign around their neck? Or I guess they didn't care. I guess that's the point. And for the men and boys, their organs were severed, their dignity stripped away in the most literal sense. Why? Well, because thanks to these old myths and superstitions, they believed that by taking away another man's virility, they could somehow bolster their own. It wasn't just an act of war. This is ritualistic, a symbolic assertion of dominance. These weren't new ideas. Ancient warrior cultures had their superstitions, their rites of passage. I mean, right? But in Nanjing, these old traditions were twisted into an alpha type of justification for brutality. The same men who swore loyalty to the emperor believed they could also absorb strength through violence, like literally through desecration. And with every atrocity, they distanced themselves further and further and further from their own humanity. Now, I'm not trying to excuse them. I hope y'all understand that. I just wanted to expose how deeply ingrained these beliefs were, how the psychological warfare wasn't just aimed at the enemies, but it was also aimed at the soldiers themselves. These were boys taught to become men through death and to receive honor through dishonor. Isn't that backwards? The echoes of these superstitions can still be felt, haunting the pages of history as a reminder of how far the human race can fall when manipulated by myth and coercion. Now, the name General Matsui Iwane is often spoken in the same breath as Nanjing's darkest of days, the commander of the Japanese Central China Area Army. That's a long one. Yet his role in the atrocities remains cloaked to this day. Here I want to relay the mentality of even the higher ranking members of the army. There's the infamous note supposedly bearing his name, ordering the slaughter of every POW, every citizen, civilian, essentially anyone breathing in Nanjing. The note stated, quote, kill all captives, end quote. Seems a bit broad, huh? The document, if authentic, condemns him as one of the architects of the largest massacres known to history. If it's a forgery, it speaks volumes about how the chaos of war allowed orders, real or fabricated, to spiral into awful brutality. Either way, his command underpinned one of the most horrifying chapters in history. And what about his peculiar reaction when confronted with this aftermath in Nanjing? The aftermath from his troops' actions. Upon touring the city after the massacre, Matsui reportedly expressed pure shock at the sheer scale of the carnage. Quote, this is the most unconscionable atrocity that I have ever seen, end quote, he allegedly said. But was this genuine regret or a calculated statement to absolve himself of responsibility? Or a calculated statement to absolve himself of responsibility? What is crystal clear is that Matsui was not blind to the flaws of his army. In a very rare and striking moment, he criticized his own soldiers in an American newspaper, the New York Times no less. He called the Japanese army, quote, one of the least disciplined in the world, end quote. A general denouncing his own troops in the enemy's press. It was almost unheard of. It stoked controversy, especially because it revealed the cracks in Japan's carefully crafted mask of military superiority. But Matsui's critique wasn't a defense in Nanjing's victims. But Matsui's critique wasn't a defense of Nanjing victims. It was an indictment of his soldiers' behavior as a reflection of dishonor to the empire. This definitely was not accountability. It was an attempt to preserve Japan's image on the global stage while deflecting blame. His words read less like an apology and more like damage control. At the end of the war, Matsui was held to account, but not by Japan, by the Allied Tribunal for War Crimes. He was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to hang. Yet even during his execution, we're left with questions. Did Matsui deserve to carry the full weight of Nanjing's atrocities? Or was he a scapegoat for a system that was so broken and demanded unwavering obedience to the emperor's will? I guess it wasn't broken to them, though, was it? Nanjing is a symbol of the devastating consequences of unchecked military power. Speaking of military power, it feels like a good time to mention John Raby, a name that shouldn't fit into this narrative of blood and brutality, or should it? A Nazi, of all people, in the heart of Nanjing during the massacre. His name probably sparks outrage by association, but in this moment, he wasn't a symbol of the Third Reich's horrors. Instead, he became an unlikely beacon of humanity amidst the darkness. Raby, a German businessman and Nazi Party member, found himself in Nanjing as the atrocities began. Witnessing the hell unfolding before his eyes, he made a choice that defied his party's ideology and risked his life. He worked with other expatriates to establish the Nanjing Safety Zone, a neutral area intended to shelter civilians from all the violence perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army. But plot twist, the safety zone wasn't really so safe, but it kind of worked anyway. I mean, at least to some extent. By throwing the Nazi flag into the equation, Raby was able to leverage Germany's alliance with Japan to shield those within the zone. Over the span of a few horrific weeks, this man, emblematic of one evil, managed to save an estimated 200,000 Chinese lives from another evil. Women and children, crammed into makeshift shelters, all clung to that slim hope of getting to the safety zone. But even Raby's efforts were far from omnipotent. Outside the zone, the streets of Nanjing were still literal rivers of blood. The Japanese soldiers, unchecked and unrepentant, continued their massacre. While Raby saved countless lives, he could not save the city. But his diaries reveal his despair. His pleas to the German and Japanese governments fell on deaf ears, though. His reports of atrocities, a call to conscience, were quietly filed away, buried by bureaucracy and geopolitics. I can't really say that I know much more about John Raby. I know it was very early on. Nanjing was 1937, if I'm not mistaken, and it could have been before the Nazi members knew a lot more. I don't know. I'm not going to excuse anything. All I'm saying is his story underscores a truth we so often forget, that humanity's survival depends not on blind loyalty, but on courage. And I'll leave it at that. It becomes more and more clear that the comfort station system wasn't a solution to sexual violence. It was the literal institutionalization of it on an unprecedented scale. War is more than a territorial conquest. What do they always say? It's a psychological game of chess, right? A perspective where the dehumanization of the quote enemy becomes more than a tactic, but dare I say, an addiction. Women in occupied territories were stripped of everything, including their humanity, and transformed into tools of war. Their suffering was rationalized, even celebrated, as a means of maintaining troop morale, in addition to all the other horrible things they were doing. The institution of comfort stations was born out of this mindset. On paper, they were established to prevent random acts of sexual violence against civilians, reduce the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, and curb insubordination among soldiers. In reality, they institutionalized those very acts of violence, codifying them into a system that tracked an estimated 200,000 women and girls from across Asia. And many say that that's on the light side. And these atrocities weren't hidden, they were sanctioned by the state, carried out with clinical efficiency. Women like Rosa, Haksun, and Kimiko were deceived, coerced, or outright kidnapped under orders from the highest levels of the military. And while the official justification might have been logistical, the underlying truth was far darker. This was obviously about power, the power to dominate, the power to control, the power to claim ownership over bodies that were deemed lesser. Misogyny wasn't just a byproduct of the empire's ideology, it became pervasive to its identity. In the eyes of the imperial machine, women were expendable, resources to be consumed and discarded how they pleased. Now let's take a few minutes to take a step into the minds of the soldiers on the other side, those who fought for the Empire of Japan. Let's pull back that curtain, not the iron curtain, of course. But yeah, let's take a look at what can make a soldier behave in such a savage and brutal way. Okay, so a boy no older than 18 from a small town in Japan is taken from his family, dressed in the same uniform as thousands of others, and thrust into the literal horrors of war. From the moment he steps onto that train, bound for the front lines, he is fed a steady diet of propaganda. His entire existence is defined by the need to serve the emperor, the same emperor who was regarded as a living god, a god whose voice echoed the righteous fury of a nation hell bent on domination. But, I mean, let's not sugarcoat it, right? This wasn't a battle for honor. This was a generation of young men literally mind numbed by a society that demanded conformity and sacrifice. Probably didn't have a choice, did they? Mm. Their education was indoctrination. Their peers? Well, they were encouraged to turn each other in for any sign of weakness, any hint of deviation from the quote, pure national ideology. The state told them, basically, that failure was treason. These soldiers were literally ready to spill blood because they were told that they were doing so for the greater good of the empire. Were they brainwashed? I like to call it thought reformed after Robert J. Lifton's book on actually on China, but anyway, yeah. I think it's safe to say they were brainwashed by their leaders into seeing their own lives as expendable, only valuable in the service to the emperor. A soldier's life was not sacred. Death in service to Japan was the only real way to prove one's worth. But here comes the really bonkers part, the vetting process for new recruits. They manufactured the horrors and the turmoil of war just for their training sessions. Psychological warfare was pushed onto the soldiers. New soldiers were bullied and mocked and humiliated, forced into cruel tests that stripped them of their humanity. And yeah, I understand. That's the army life for you, right? But yeah, I think this was a little more drastic. They wanted to see if soldiers could kill. And not just enemies, but anyone. It didn't matter who. A civilian, a prisoner of war. It didn't matter. The officers would watch who stood in front of them and see what they did. And they would push them, train them, push them long before they ever set foot on the front lines. Eventually, as a reward for making it to those front lines, they were given the unquestionable right to conquer. Empathy doesn't erase the blood on their hands, just as the machine that brainwashed them can't wash it off. These boys came from families and they had dreams before their country took them and turned them into something unrecognizable. The same empire that told them to kill also conveniently taught them how to die, with honor, of course. And though they were victims too, respectfully, let's not confuse that empathy with absolution and without questioning. And when they returned, or didn't, who would ask them the questions that needed to be asked? No one. No one in their ranks. They were no longer individuals, but hollow shells of their former selves, the people formerly known as insert name here. But we have to ask who left them there to wear the scars of history's most horrendous war crimes, while they themselves went pretty well unpunished. I hope I have been successful at emphasizing the brutality and the calculated methods that were used by the Imperial Army to ensure obedience and violence in their soldiers. And it wasn't just Japanese soldiers complicit in this system. Behind the front lines, bureaucrats, doctors, and officers ensured the smooth operation of these stations. Physicians administered forced medical examinations, ensuring the women were, quote, fit for use. Administrators oversaw logistics, tracking the movement of the women as though they were supplies rather than human beings. Even after the war ended, the legacy of this institution still lingered. Survivors like Rosa, Hakusun, and Kimiko returned to societies that refused to even acknowledge their suffering. And even worse, sometimes they were shunned by their own family after gathering the courage to try to go back to wherever home was. Silence was demanded by the Japanese government's desperation to avoid accountability. The Empire of Japan may have fallen in 1945, but the attitudes sustained it didn't vanish overnight. The denial of responsibility and the refusal to compensate survivors points to a global complicity in allowing these crimes to fade into obscurity, making it possible to erase their stories from official historical accounts. And yet, these women's stories refused to go away. Their voices, once silenced by fear and shame, became a cry for justice. Rosa, Hakusun, and Kimiko were victims, living indictments of the misogynistic systems that enabled this nightmare to occur. By the way, the role of the other powers, including American forces, also perpetuated misogynistic systems through war crimes by using these horrifying stations. While it also should have been totally obvious that these women were being forced to be there, it seems that the obvious went ignored. The institutionalized misogyny of the Japanese Empire was mirrored, and in some ways it was reinforced by societal attitudes towards women and sexual violence in the occupied territories. Long before the first comfort stations were constructed, the notion of a woman's worth was often tied to her chastity, her modesty, her perceived purity. All gross. Nowhere was this more evident than in the cultural practice surrounding the unjangdo, a small ornamental dagger traditionally carried, typically, I think, by Korean women. Originally a symbol of self-defense and and personal protection, the unjangdo took on a darker significance during the years of Japanese occupation. In an environment where a woman's honor was seen as the property of her family or her husband, the unjangdo became both a shield and also a trap. It was carried not just to fend off attackers, but disturbingly enough, to be turned inward, used by women to take their own lives in the event of a sexual assault. The idea was that death was preferable to the shame of being deemed unfaithful. That's right, folks. That's what I said. Being SA'd was seen as being unfaithful, if that tells you anything about the misogynistic climate around there and during that time. And this was the societal landscape into which Kim Hak-soon, Maria Rosa Henson, and Kimiko Kaneda were born. A world where the shame of SA was not placed on the perpetrator, but on the victim. But I mean, we still live in that world to an extent, so I guess that's why we're here listening, isn't it? For many women, silence was the only refuge. To speak of such violence was to risk ostracism, judgment, and an unbearable stain on their family. And yet, amazingly, there were those who chose to speak. Kim Hak-soon's story began in this deeply patriarchal context. She grew up in a Korea shaped by Confucian ideals, where the obedience and chastity of women were prized above all else. But her like but her life took a devastating turn when she was possibly sold to a man by her stepfather, or as we discussed earlier, she was abducted right on the spot by a Japanese official. But anyway, after the war, Kim Hok-soon returned to a society that demanded her silence. For decades, she bore her pain alone, grappling with the trauma of her experiences in a world that refused to acknowledge them. It wasn't until 1991, nearly a half a century later, that Kim Hok-soon broke the silence. Her testimony was a raw, unflinching account that shattered the thin mask of denial that Japan had carried. She described the systemic nature of the comfort station system, the physical and the psychological scars it left behind, and also the complicity of those who pretended they didn't see anything. Her courage sparked a ripple effect. Women across Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and beyond began to step forward, their voices forming a crescendoing chorus that could no longer be ignored. Kimiko Kaneda's story resonated within this growing movement. Her life after the war was marked by addiction, a cruel little gift from the substances forced upon her during captivity. While Hoksoon's testimony shook the foundations of denial, Kimiko's story illuminated the depths of despair where the stations lived, thrived, and fed on the suffering of these women. And it still continues to haunt survivors to this day. Maria's voice joined this rising tide, bringing the perspective of the Philippines into a narrative often dominated by East Asia. By sharing her truth, she connected these stories across borders, revealing the shared suffering of women who have all been through the same brutal crimes and inhumane treatment. And now they were bound together by that nightmare, but at least they were bound to each other. People could relate with each other's trauma and circumstances. The women speaking their truths forced a reckoning that persists to this day. But that reckoning hasn't come without resistance, of course. While survivors bravely confronted their trauma, many institutions and even nations clung desperately to their denials. Among them, of course, was Japan, whose official response to the comfort station issue has been a masterclass of evasion and victim blaming. Despite a handful of former apologies, Japan has consistently downplayed its role in the system of the comfort women. Government officials have referred to the women as, quote, volunteers or, quote, professional prostitutes, perpetuating a narrative that absolves the state of any responsibility. But here's a question. How can minors consent to sex work? As Kim Hok-sun bravely asked during one of the trials, is that what 14-year-olds do to make money? In 2014, the publication of The Comfort Women Hoax by Japanese nationalist Nishioka Tsutomu represented a chilling escalation of revisionist history. The book claimed that the comfort women narrative was completely fabricated, a conspiracy designed to tarnish, what do you think I'm going to say? That's right, Japan's reputation. It 100% ignored mountains and mountains of evidence, military documents, survivor testimonies, even statements from former Japanese soldiers themselves. I mean, but the denial didn't stop there. Oh no. In classrooms across Japan, textbooks were sanitized to admit the history of the comfort stations entirely, robbing new generations of the chance to confront their nation's past. Sanitizing history books, huh? That doesn't sound familiar. Nope. The burden of denial doesn't rest solely on Japan's shoulders. Other powers, too, have their own reckoning to face. Powers like the United States, as I briefly discussed earlier. In the aftermath of World War II, American forces occupied Japan ostensibly to dismantle its imperialness. But as we now know, records have revealed some of these forces perpetuated the very systems they supposedly sought to dismantle. Comfort stations didn't vanish with Japan's surrender. They were repurposed, serving American soldiers who were fully aware that the women in these stations were held against their will. Documents from the occupation show that U.S. officials knew about the coercion and abuse, but instead they turned a blind eye to it and indulged themselves at the continued cost of these women. This complicity adds such a chilling dimension to the sexually enslaved women's stories. It reveals a broader global failure to value women's autonomy and humanity, which seems to be a trend these days. For Maria Rosa Henson, Kim Hok-sun, and Kimiko Kaneda, speaking out was a direct challenge to the systems that sought to erase them. Their testimonies exposed the ongoing mechanisms, the gaslighting, the coercion, and the complicity that allow these war crimes to fester. And today, the fight continues. Survivors and their advocates have demanded reparations, public acknowledgement, and education about what happened in the comfort station systems. They've won some victories, memorials in South Korea, legal rulings in favor of survivors, and international solidarity. But of course, the road to justice is far from over. In Japan, statues honoring comfort women have been vandalized, protests against their memorialization continue, and courts dismiss lawsuits filed by survivors. I'd like to reflect on the bravery of Maria, Haksun, and Kimiko. And as years have turned into decades, the stories of these brave women remain etched in history. But forgetting isn't an option. Not for the survivors who bore the scars of this exploitation, not for the families who inherited the pain of the people affected, and not for the activists who to this day refuse to let the truth be buried under propaganda and lies. Every Wednesday, in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, South Korea, a group gathers. The faces may change, but the mission remains the same: justice for the women forced into sexual servitude at the hands of the Japanese Empire. These Wednesday demonstrations have become one of the longest running protests in the world. They began in 1992, shortly after Haksun's groundbreaking testimony, and have continued uninterrupted for more than 3 decades. Each week, protesters demand what should have been given so long ago: acknowledgement. Not half hearted statements of regret, not vague gestures or victim blaming, but a full and unequivocal admission of guilt. And yet, The Japanese government remains steadfast in its refusal to fully accept culpability. Instead, they continue to dilute the truth. Official statements waltz around accountability. Textbooks clean up the past like historical janitors. Statues erected in memory of the victims face vandalism and removal under pressure from the Japanese officials. The message is clear. The shame of acknowledgement is, to them at least, worse than the crime itself. But the Wednesday demonstrations stand encased as a testament to the power of memory and trauma. They remind us that justice is a moral imperative. It's the refusal to let the voices of the oppressed be silenced and the insistence that the past cannot be rewritten to be more comfortable for those in power. The bravery of Maria, Hakusun, and Kimiko forced the world to confront its darkest, most terrifying depths. For every survivor who never lived to see justice, for every woman whose name we will never know who was affected, these protests are a living legacy. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey. This has been Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Remember, be vigilant, be vocal, because silence is complicity. I'll see you next time in the sack. Source notes can be found on Podbean. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach me at greatinthesackpodcast@gmail.com. I'm also on the other social medias, most of all of them. Thank you so much.